All right, good morning, everybody. This is Jeff Spring at the Department of Commerce, and before we get going, I want to make sure that everybody can hear me. So you'll notice on your webinar dashboard that you have a logo for a hand, to raise your hand, and I'd like to ask you to press that button so I can see that you can hear me. Good, okay, looks like I'm getting through loud and clear. Thanks for joining, everybody. I'm joined here with my CHG colleagues Stephanie and Jessica and Emily and Julie. On the line also is Kathy Kennard. And our purpose today is to go over the changes to the CHG guidelines that we sent you towards the end of December. So the way we're going to do this is my teammates and I are going to divvy up the presentations. And at the end of each presenter's session, we'll pause for questions and answers. And if you have entered your audio pin, we can unmute you and let you speak to the entire crowd. Otherwise, we'll translate your questions that you can enter on the question pane of your GoToWebinar dashboard. So let's see. Also wanted to point out that this is not a training. This is just a changes to the guidelines update, and we're going to be doing grantee trainings on March 2nd, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. So stay tuned for that news coming out soon. Have I missed anything? Oh, if you happen to have your guidelines handy, that would be a good thing. You'll be able to follow along with each presenter as we move through the various sections of the guidelines. So with that, I'll get this thing started. I think I will. So what's new? So in these guidelines, in addition to some updated policies and some new policies, the biggest and most obvious change you're going to see is a change to the style and the format and the layout of the document. So if you're holding this document in your hands, you've already realized that it's about half the size of the previous versions. So in doing this version of the guidelines, we eliminated a lot of the explanations and rationales for some of the concepts that we introduced in previous years, and we've reorganized the content that is remaining into an organization that we think you'll find much easier to locate the information you're looking for. There are links within this document, both to other places within the document itself, as well as to web-based sources of information. And then lastly, you'll recall from previous versions of the guidelines that there were charts and tables scattered throughout the document. Most of those have been moved to an appendix at the end of the document with one or two exceptions. Otherwise, you'll find all the charts and tables at the end of the document. So with the information that was remaining after we paired out all our explanations and rationales, we reorganized that remaining content into these 7 categories. So grant basics, administrative requirements of lead grantees, the interventions that you can apply, household eligibility, the expenses that you can charge under CHG, requirements of direct service providers, and a section on additional requirements for service providers that provide rent assistance. So, section 1, grant basics. There's not a lot of new information in these sections. The overview section talks basically about what the CHG grant is for, to assist people who are experiencing homelessness. And we also list the state law, the RCW 43185C, that is the authorization for spending this money and operating this program. And this is a good time to talk about a document that actually is not, or some information that is not in the guidelines themselves, but speaks to kind of the depth and the breadth of the work that you'll be doing under this contract. And you'll find the scope of work in the contract document towards the very end of that document, and every lead grantee and sub-grantee has one of these contract documents. So if you get a hold of a copy of that contract and look at the scope of work, you'll find that there's more detail than this. There's some finer detail, but the main points are about what you're committing to do, which is to end homelessness in your counties. And then there's information about submitting monthly deliverables, so that would be invoice reports on time and accurately. There's a section and some bullet points about entering HMIS data accurately and timely. And then there's some additional bullet points about staying in compliance with the contract, and that basically is following the requirements and policies that are outlined in the guidelines, which is what we're going through right now. Section 2, administrative requirements of lead grantees. So this is broken into some subsections. So there are the things that lead grantees are required to do that have to do with their entire homeless systems within their communities. And the first bullet point that I want to point to is the prioritization of unsheltered clients. So this is the policy you've heard us talking about since roughly last summer, where a minimum of 35% of the people that you serve must be unsheltered. If you want to go above that, that's great. We will applaud that. But at a minimum, we want you to be serving 35% of the people you serve to be unsheltered. We have made a little more concise the section on coordinated entry. So that is also the responsibility of the lead grantee to coordinate and organize within their communities. And then there is all the various reporting requirements, be they monthly or annual reports, are encapsulated under this section, under homeless system responsibilities. Under grant management, also under section 2, there's not a lot of new information here, but this is where you'll find text about the changes to the guidelines that may be forthcoming in the future. There's some information about the monitoring that Commerce will perform of lead grantees. And then there is information about sub-grantee risk assessment and monitoring. You'll find that also under section 2. Section 2 continued is the information around fiscal administration. So there are sections that describe the new and greatly reduced budget categories that we have. There is information about budget caps. So those are the 15% admin that you can't spend above, or the 7% of HEN admin that you can't exceed, or the 36% budgeting set aside and spending of for-profit landowners. So all that information is contained within these budget caps sections. There's also information about the reimbursement procedures. There's nothing new, although I will say that instead of the old HMIS reports that you have been sending us for the last 2 years, we have a new invoice report that we'll be sending to you in a couple of weeks that will be populated by data that you get from 3 new HMIS reports, and we'll send you instructions on how to run those reports and populate this invoice form, hopefully within the next couple of weeks. And then also information about backup documentation and budget revisions, which isn't any different than it's been in the past. And with that, Stephanie is next up, but I want to pause for questions. Are there questions? Okay.
Nope.
Oh, and Emily points out that, rightly so, that there are no longer match requirements for any of the CHG funding. So if you didn't get that when we sent the policy revisions out earlier or late last year, there are no longer any requirements for matching CHG funds. All right, Stephanie.
Hi, this is Stephanie Reinauer, and I'm going to be going over Section 3, Allowable Interventions. What's new here from the previous guidelines is really it's organized differently. We introduce early on in the guidelines defining the different allowable interventions that you can fund, and then they're referred to throughout the guidelines. Previously, the definitions were sort of scattered throughout in different sections regarding eligibility and allowable expenses. There are different eligibility requirements for different types of interventions, so that'll be gone over more when Emily talks about eligibility. And their allowable expenses overlap different intervention types, and Julie's going to talk more about allowable expenses later. The two main types of interventions are temporary housing interventions, when the household must leave the unit at the end of the program. Whether it's 1 week or 2 years, the program is time limited, and the household is still considered homeless while they are in that type of program. The other broad category is permanent housing interventions. Households can stay as long as they meet the tenancy requirements. It doesn't necessarily, permanent doesn't mean forever, but it means as long as the household wants. It's not, there's not an external time limit on how long they can stay in the unit or the program. They're not homeless while they're in this type of program for point-in-time purposes, but they might be maintain homeless eligibility for different entering other programs. So temporary housing interventions, the three types: drop-in shelter, continuous stay shelter, or interim housing. A drop-in shelter is facility-based, night-by-night living arrangement that allows clients to enter and exit on an irregular or daily basis. It could be a bunkhouse or open rooms with mats. There's usually minimum services offered and usually minimum requirements for entry. Continuous stay shelter is facility-based or a hotel-motel voucher where the household has a room or a bed assigned to them for up to 90 days. It may be a shared room, or it could be their own apartment, or anything in between, but there are usually program participation requirements, and they often work with a case manager while they're in that program. Interim housing, this is previously known as temporary housing in our last guidelines. So this is also facility-based housing where the households have a room or a bed assigned to them, but this is for more than 90 days. So the big difference here is this is up to 90 days to continuous stay shelter, and then 91 days to 24 months is considered interim housing. And so in some programs, you might have a fluid program or a situation where people stay longer than 90 days, and then that becomes interim housing. So you want to pay attention because some different eligibility requirements might kick in at that point. Whether that's something that your program normally does, kind of has a fluid use of units going between the shelter or interim housing, or whether it's a once-in-a-while exception for a household that needed additional time. So pay attention to that, especially when we talk about eligibility. And at this term, you've probably most heard this term. It's been going around for a couple of years. It's sort of a reframing of the transitional housing model. Often it's something between an emergency shelter and transitional housing where folks are reducing transitional housing stays and don't really want to use that framework anymore that maybe encourages a longer 1 or 2 year stay. So interim is, it's not permanent, but it's providing some length of shelter. And then permanent housing interventions, these should all be familiar terms: targeted prevention, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing. Permanent housing, again, is housing that the household can stay in as long as they meet the basic obligations of tenancy. Targeted prevention resolves imminent homelessness with temporary rent subsidies and housing-focused case management. It does require the targeted prevention screening tool, which has been updated. And rapid rehousing is also a rent assistance and housing-focused case management program. This is for homeless households. It's quickly getting households into housing. So these might look different. I mean, they might look very similar as far as what types of services and rent assistance the families are getting or the households are getting, but the main difference is the household homeless or not when they enter the program, and that's the distinction. These are distinct in HMIS as well. And then the other new change here is permanent supportive housing. It used to only be fundable through CHG with incentive or performance funds, and now it's fundable with base funding. That's the main difference here, and because of that, we've gone through some more specifics with the eligibility requirements and defining what this looks like in our new guidelines than we have in the past. It's subsidized, non-time limited housing with support services for homeless households that include an adult member with a permanent disability. So that is both the definition and the eligibility. Support services must be made available, but participation is voluntary, so the client or the resident doesn't have to participate, but there need to be services attached to that housing. In permanent supportive housing might be a rent assistance model, sometimes called a scattered site model, or it could be facility-based. So it's not important the form of housing, it's really important that it's permanent and that there are those services for that population. Both the services and the housing are available permanently. Just to distinguish between rapid rehousing, the program might end and the services might end, but the household might stay in that unit that they're renting. They're just going to take over the rent on their own. Permanent supportive housing, both the subsidy and the services are going to be ongoing, not time limited. Another thing you might see is someone could move to a different unit and they're still part of the same permanent program. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're in that same apartment or that same room forever. It could be continued in a different program. So there's a lot of different situations that might come up here if you're only used to doing these types of programs. Any questions on the types of interventions?
So we have a couple of hands raised.
I don't know if they were from before.
Alexis, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Maybe put them all down. And then
yeah, so I'm going to lower everybody's hands. And if you have a question, I encourage you to either enter it into the question pane on your webinar dashboard, or if you've entered an audio pin, click on the hand raising button and we can unmute you so you can speak to the entire group. And with no questions, Emily is up next. We have to click on the webinar. I mean on the PowerPoint, yeah.
Okay. Hello, this is Emily. So I'm going to go over the household eligibility guidelines, which there are some changes. A household needs to meet both housing status and income requirements to be eligible for the CHG program. So the household needs to be homeless or at imminent risk of homelessness and be at or below 30% area median income, or have a HEN referral, or be TANF enrolled. So the big change is that there's not a difference regarding the AMI for households with children and singles or individuals. Everybody has to be at or below 30% of AMI. So I'm going to talk more about the housing status eligibility part. There's some differences in how we organize this section and how we are defining things. If you look at the guidelines, which I'm going to pull up. Okay. Hurry up. Why isn't it moving?
Do you have a computer for our job? Can you tear it down or something?
Oh. Okay, sorry, it was stalling there. Okay. So here's the definition of homeless. And we've separated it out. It used to all be together, and we've separated it to unsheltered homeless and sheltered homeless. And the reason for that is that so you know when we talk about prioritizing unsheltered homeless households, you know exactly how we define that. So the definition hasn't changed, we've just separated it out. The definition for exiting a system of care and that type of homelessness has changed a bit right here. So previously, people would be considered homeless if they're exiting a system of care and had nowhere else to go. So we've changed this to align with the HMIS data standards. So to meet this definition, someone would be exiting a system of care or institution where they resided for 90 days or less and resided in an emergency shelter or place not meant for human habitation immediately before entering that system of care. So that's aligned with HUD and the HMIS data standards now, and that is a change. Go back to this.
You want to go into slideshow from current slide.
Okay. The definition of at imminent risk of homelessness has also changed a bit, and that was also to align with HMIS data standards. So previously, someone was considered at risk if they would lose their primary nighttime residence within 14 days. And to align with HMIS data standards, we added, and no subsequent residents have been identified, and the household lacks the resources or support networks needed to obtain other permanent housing. So that's a little bit different, and there's some additional documentation required for that piece, which I will talk about now. So, okay, let me get to the form. There we go. So here's the updated verification of household eligibility and income recertification form. We've added a new section, section 4, to document those additional components for households who are at risk. So for all of the prevention, rent assistance clients, or households that are at risk of homelessness, you would need to complete the first section as usual, documenting that they're at risk, and then you'll need to go to this section 4 and complete the rest of the documentation that they don't have financial resources or support networks necessary to obtain other permanent housing, and that no other housing options have been identified. So that's new. Oh, let me go back. So another thing that's not new, but to remember, is that you don't need to document housing status for people who are entering your drop-in shelter or continuous stay shelter. That's not new, but it's something to remember. So like I said, income eligibility has changed. So households need to be at or below 30% AMI, but you don't need to document income eligibility for homeless households until they've been in the program for 90 days. And we have a chart on page 13 that will be helpful for you when you're looking at income eligibility and when you need to check it and when you need to document it. So I'm going to pull that up so you can see that. So here we go. So for a drop-in shelter, you don't need to do any income checks or income eligibility documentation. For a continuous stay shelter, that's a 90-day stay or less, you don't need to do any income eligibility check or documentation. If the household is staying in that shelter over 90 days, then at that point you would look at these income requirements for interim housing, and then these would apply because they've exceeded the 90 days. So at that point, you would need to check that they are at or below 30% AMI. For interim housing, otherwise known as temporary or transitional housing, for homeless households, you don't need to check or document their income until they get to the 90 days. If they're at-risk household, they have to be at or below 30% AMI. So for homeless households, you don't need to check the income until 90 days. Same goes for rent assistance. So for a rapid rehousing program where you're serving homeless households, the income eligibility is waived for 90 days. At 90 days or recertification, then the 30% AMI is going to apply. For HEN rent assistance programs, the only thing you need to know at enrollment is that they're homeless or at risk and they have the DSHS HEN referral. For households whose income source is TANF, it's like HEN. The only thing you need to check at enrollment is that they are enrolled in TANF and homeless or at risk of homelessness. For the permanent supportive housing programs, you do have to check at enrollment if they are at or below 30% AMI. And like Stephanie mentioned earlier, the other program requirement is that there's an adult household member with a permanent disability. Are there any questions?
Yeah, there's a bunch.
Oh, there's a bunch.
Bunch of questions.
Okay.
So, wow, these are hard to read.
No, they're very small.
So we have a bunch of questions, so we're going to read them and then
Let's
answer
get
them.
off the screen up here, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Is the questions left?
Yeah, that's right.
Just expand it.
You have to pull it out. Grab up top.
Where?
I think it's right up here.
Oh, that's right. Ah, like that.
Oh, okay.
So let's go through
I
these.
think there's more up top higher.
In order to be found unsheltered homeless, does a household need to meet the definition based on where they spent the night last night?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So that refers to the prior living situation in HMIS, which points to where the client stayed the night before they presented for assistance.
Good question.
So I do want to point out, just as this relates to our performance measure of serving unsheltered, so we're really looking at systems, and so if somebody was literally homeless and then they entered an emergency shelter, so they're still literally homeless, but they're now sheltered homeless, and then they enter your rapid rehousing program, we're looking that household, they entered the system from being unsheltered. And so when we're measuring that performance element, I don't know if that pertains to this question. And it could be tricky if where they entered the system was a program that doesn't participate in HMIS, that doesn't receive our funding. So that's the type of thing when we look at the performance community by community, we can look into some of those subtleties.
Okay, the next question is, must a household be enrolled in a rapid rehousing program to be eligible for flexible funding? How is it different than what a household would get in a rapid rehousing program? We're going to talk more about the flexible funding in the allowable expenses section of this webinar, But no, the household needs to be homeless to be eligible for the flexible funding. And Julie will talk more about how it's different from the services you can receive in a rent assistance program. So just hold tight on that.
We'll go back up.
Okay, well that was tied to a question about.
Oh.
There's more of those.
Yeah, you want to just go to the top.
Okay, well, the ones with check marks are answered.
Okay.
Will there be changes in HMIS to relate to the unsheltered homeless and sheltered homeless? No.
Well, sort of. But we've done that already. So unsheltered versus sheltered is now represented in HMIS by the presence of distinct rapid rehousing programs and distinct homeless prevention programs. Once upon a time, those were the same programs, and they've been split out now. No.
Well, but this is about the unsheltered homeless and sheltered homeless. So, and you can kind of, if you look at the definitions of those, it doesn't tell you what HMIS field, but so to be considered unsheltered homeless, you were living outside or in a place not meant for habitation. And that would be the HMIS prior living situation is place not meant for human habitation. Or you're fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. And that would be the housing status category for fleeing domestic violence. So those are already existing things in HMIS. So there's no change to HMIS to measure that. And then the sheltered homeless would be someone, you know, residing in a temporary housing program, and that would be many different prior living situation fields in HMIS.
So I think we also want to read the ones we answered there so everyone can know the answer. But you don't have to do it.
We can revisit it later.
Okay, let's keep going. Here's a few more questions.
Okay. If the income requirement language includes at or below 30% of AMI or HEN enrolled, is the income recertification required? So for HEN, at recertification, they need to have the HEN referral, and you have to check the income that it's at or below 30% of AMI. Yes. What about clients who are at risk of homelessness due to constant moves to doubling up? Are they considered homeless or at risk? Can you still serve them? So if a client the night before was staying with family or friends, they could be considered at risk if they meet the definition of at imminent risk of homelessness, all components of it. So where they stayed last night doesn't necessarily, if they stayed with family or friends, doesn't necessarily mean that they're at risk of homelessness. You'd have to, you know, make sure they meet all of the criteria to be eligible for the program. And if they meet our definition of at imminent risk of homelessness, yes, you could serve them. Another question. PSH eligibility requirements do not align with federal. Federal allows a child to be the disabled family member and no income requirements. Why is CHG different? What is the reason for this? Yes, that is true. They do not align with the federal definition.
The federal did have two different types of permanent supportive housing, and we were trying, this is new to CHG-based funding, and we're trying to keep it simple and keep it targeted, and that was the decision that we made. It could change in the future, especially if we see a lot more people using CHG-based funds for permanent supportive housing. We're really excited to see how this plays out, but this is new for us, and that's where we're going right now.
Oh my gosh, there's a lot of questions. Okay. If we receive a referral for a family who is in shelter but has been considered unsheltered within the last 2 years, does this qualify the referral as unsheltered? That would, if they've been unsheltered in the past 2 years, that would sort of count towards your priority measurement, and I think that that's what you're referring to is how we've proposed to measure the unsheltered prioritization in HMI, or using HMIS for that performance measurement. But as far as the eligibility for the program, where they stayed last night is going to determine their housing status for the Consolidated Homeless Grant.
And that's how they should be entered in HMIS.
Yeah.
For that particular program should just be sheltered as their prior residence.
Okay, here's another question. Just to clarify, if a client who is literally homeless were to enter a rent assistance and she or he has an income, then we do not need to check the client's income for 90 days. And therefore, she or he does not have to pay a portion of the rent.
You got that?
Yeah. No. So you don't need to, we're not requiring for a literally homeless person, housing status homeless, sheltered or unsheltered, you don't have to check and document their income, but that doesn't have anything to do with how you determine the rent subsidy. That's your procedure that you have to develop. So probably a lot of programs are going to check income when they're going to determine the rent subsidy they pay. We're just not requiring that you document it, and our reason for that is to eliminate barriers to service. But we do think you're probably going to do that if you're going to determine the rent. So it doesn't have anything to do with the portion of rent that people pay or the subsidy that you pay.
Yep. Great.
What type of homeless status would someone who is in a DV shelter be in? Sheltered or unsheltered? Well, in HMIS, someone fleeing domestic violence is Category 4 fleeing domestic violence, and that's homeless, and we're considering that unsheltered homeless.
But the prior, if they're going from that shelter to another shelter, the prior residence would be sheltered, right? Even if it was Category 4. Yes. Yeah, they're asking about homeless status.
If we are only entering unsheltered for prior living situation for clients who are unsheltered today, how are you going to measure the families who may not be unsheltered today, but they still meet the requirement of being sheltered in the past 2 years? Well, you've been entering these HMIS fields already. There's no change to anything in HMIS, and we'll talk more about how we're going to measure the prioritization. So maybe I'm not understanding that question.
We're going to look at the data.
Yeah, we're going to.
2 years ago.
Yeah.
You don't have to capture that.
Yeah, we're going to look at the data that's already in HMIS to get the baseline count for how many unsheltered households you've been serving. So there shouldn't be there's not really any change to how you enter things in HMIS. How can you measure success as high use of CHG for PSH if the restrictions do not let us use CHG for PSH? I don't know if I understand that question. We'll have to follow up on that one. If a HEN client has income at the 90-day point and are under the 30% AMI, do they need to contribute 30% of their income towards rent? Well, that depends on the procedure you've developed in your agency to determine how much of a rent subsidy you pay and what the household's share of the rent is. So I really can't answer that question. It's a local decision. If we cannot add another restriction to our PSH programs, that is only for CHG. So this restrictions make CHG not useful for most PSH programs. Oh, that's about the child thing. In a rapid rehousing program, does the 90 days before income eligibility is measured begin at housing search or when the subsidy begins? That's a good question. When the subsidy begins. Yeah, because that's when their program enrollment really starts. Please clarify again when we use Category 4 for housing status. Category 4 is for people who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. And that means that they're in danger from domestic violence. And that's when you use it.
The only new thing is, I think, fleeing human trafficking has been added.
Yeah, let me get to the... Yeah, we can follow. It's defined in the guidelines. Look in the unsheltered homeless part of the guidelines, and it has all of the ways where you would use the Category 4 fleeing domestic violence. And you can also follow up with the HMIS technical assistance about that one. Okay, lots of great questions.
So up next is Julie to talk about allowable expenses.
Okay, hi, this is Julie Montgomery, and I'm going over, let's see, what can CHG pay for. So this is Section 5, allowable expenses, and one big change is that allowable expenses are all grouped together now, so hopefully it'll be easy to find this information when you need it quickly. And so for administration, there were just some small changes. We're just encouraging you, there's nothing that we need to go over here necessarily, but have your bookkeepers or people responsible for your accounting to go over this section and ask us if they have any questions. And in operations, since there's no longer a data collection and entry section under the budget categories, you'll see some of the expenses that were under data collection now under operations, so system-wide expenses, your point-in-time counts, housing inventory, homeless plans. And then in the programmatic expenses section, there's also no changes except that data collection is now under that. The big change here is the flexible funding, and so I'm going to go. And so flexible funding was added to address the needs of homeless households who may have expenses that are keeping them out of permanent housing. And so this is the provision of goods or payments that directly help a household to obtain or maintain permanent housing. This is for homeless households, and it's up to $1,500 per household. And then we've listed out some examples of what would fit under this category. And so these are things that may have not been covered in the past. So something like legal fees, moving costs to get somebody into housing, toiletries, cleaning supplies, an expense that would be related to helping somebody to get a job so that they can get income, work shoes or a uniform, certification, and then emergency needs, food, baby formula, diapers, clothing. Something that we talked about is that an ineligible expense in the previous guidelines was pet deposits, and that's something that could fit under flexible funding now if that's something that's keeping a family from being housed. And ineligible under the section, gift cards, vouchers, and certificates. So this is the big new change here, and hopefully this will free up you to be able to get some people housed who had expenses that we weren't covering before. So under essential needs, nothing really has changed there. Also, things are just pretty much the same. You need a HEN referral. And then in rent, something that we called out is just that for HEN and for PSH, there's no time limit on rent assistance, but for all other CHG rent assistance programs, it's listed to it's limited to 24 months. And again, under facility support, I'm sorry. Did you have
flexible funding?
Yeah, let's go to flexible funding. Oh, I can. Let's see. I can pull this up.
Okay. In the billing process, are flexible funds covered under the rent and housing costs category?
No, it's in operations.
Yes.
Great question.
Yeah, good question. And I'll have lots of time for flexible funding questions because really there's no other changes under these sections. Facility support, still things are the same. We still have the section on maintenance as allowable expenses under facility support, but building rehab is not, and so that's outlined on page 20. And then there's the table on page 21 that outlines allowable expenses for facility maintenance. And so are there other questions on flexible funding?
Or any allowable
expenses, right? Okay, that's my short section. Yeah.
Okay, moving on to section 6, requirements of all lead grantees and sub-grantees providing direct services. So I'm actually going to go to the guidelines.
Escape key.
Okay, here we go. So progressive engagement, as you know, was in the last contract and the last guidelines, and it is individualized services for each household. I think most of us are pretty familiar with progressive engagement since we've been to lots of trainings on it, but this model was a should in our last guidelines, and now we have made it a must as a model that you must be employing. We've also added some more concise language on what we expect progressive engagement to look like. We have added things such as supportive services should be voluntary and built on the strengths and resources of each individual household. That's one of the things we've added. We've also added some more things that I will let you read later. They're pretty much the same. Moving on to assessment and housing stability planning. How assessments and housing stability planning is still required. The criteria of what's actually required has changed a bit. We're being less prescriptive on how you actually do the housing stability planning. It still must be housing focused and client driven, but the way that you document how you're doing that has changed. We do not tell you that it needs to be in a form. We're actually letting you decide how you want to document it, and that could be in a form or it could be actually in case notes. And then I also just point out that assessments and housing stability planning are not required for drop-in shelters as normal. The HMIS section this used to be an appendix, and I'm not sure if anybody ever read it, so we brought it into the guidelines, and it's condensed down quite a bit, but it identified things such as data entry timeliness, consent for entry of personal identifying information. Most of this you know, but we wanted to put something in the guidelines that talked about HMIS because before it was just a standalone appendix. Some additional requirements these are all ones that were in the guidelines before, but we put them all in one area. Fraud, letting us know if there's if CHG funds are spent in any fraudulent way, of letting us know. The grievance procedure and the termination of denial of service policy, these are nearly identical to what was there before, but you'll notice they've been rewritten. So I would advise you to take a look. They're just more concise than how they were written before. Record maintenance and destruction. So this section was actually in 2 different places last time. The one part of it was in the grant general terms and conditions, which it still is there. The other part of this in records regarding to HMIS was in that appendix that we're not sure anyone ever looked at. So now we brought it into the guidelines in one place so you can see exactly what's required for records maintenance. The fabulous client file checklist that we love, we've called out that it's required, which all of you are doing. The consent to review information, this is talking about that all households must provide an informed consent using the BVS or EJAS form from DSHS. So we've mentioned it before, but we did not provide quite as much information. So if you're checking BVS for HEN, or if you are one of the few counties that are using EJAS and you're looking in EJAS, you have to use the BVS form. Client satisfaction survey. This was not in the guidelines, although it was a requirement. We've sent some information out in the CHG communications, but it's never been in the guidelines on how specifically what you must do to comply with this requirement. So this gives you some options on how to comply with the client satisfaction survey that is required for all households receiving CHG funds. Prohibitions, these are not new, they're just in one spot now. You cannot require clients to participate in religious services, and you cannot deny shelter to a household that's unable to pay for shelter. Non-discrimination is new to the guidelines, but it has always been in your contract. So we decided to put it here for people to call more attention to it, because in the contract we're not sure that program staff are reading the contract documents. And habitability, nothing has changed at this point. For rent assistance, it's still the same. You have 2 allowable ways for unit habitability: an actual inspection or the landlord habitability standard certification. You have to have a complaint policy for rent, and facilities, you have to do an inspection at least once a year. Same for lead, nothing has changed. Lead-based paint inspections, nothing has changed. So there you go.
We have some questions.
Okay.
You want to read this?
Yeah. We've always
Does making supportive services voluntary mean that the clients can choose not to participate in case management?
Yeah, which one? I need to read it. I'm just going to read the question from the beginning. Does making supportive services voluntary mean that the clients can choose not to participate in case management or to work on the goals that they have established at enrollment?
Supportive services are different than case management, and I think it's important to think about those two aspects of interacting with a client. So when we think about supportive services, can someone think of it?
So, for example, requiring someone participate in a treatment program, or requiring someone to complete a financial literacy class in order to receive rent assistance, or a parenting class, something like that would it's great to have those services available to clients, but to have them required in order to receive help with their homelessness is really not a best practice.
No. How many times over the course of a service must a client complete the satisfaction survey? Do you have an electronic of the survey we can give to clients, or we need to give them, type it up by hand? So we want to get information on client satisfaction, and I think it's over the course of the instance of support you're giving them. So if you're helping them in a shelter situation and they've gone to a rapid rehousing program, that would be the end of the housing intervention, and you could offer them the survey. We can certainly put the questions in a Word copy for you, and again, there's just so many ways to get this survey to them. You can provide them the link, an opportunity at your agency to complete it. You can give them a Word copy, and they could fill it out, and you could enter it for them. We're just trying to give us a wide opportunity to get information back from clients, but the answer to the original question is at the end of the assistance through your agency.
So somebody brought up a great question, which they're actually correct about inspections required for drop-in shelters. That actually is a change. So if you have a drop-in shelter, we now require inspections. Mm-hmm. That actually is a change.
So it's the same inspection that we require for other programs that would be completed annually. It doesn't have to be in every client file. It just needs to be completed annually for the facility and kept on file at your agency for review.
Next question is, does the prohibition on charging clients unable to pay apply to minimum rent
for shelter
income ratios for rent assistance programs? No. Does not apply to rent assistance. It only provides to shelter.
And it's not a new requirement.
Yeah, that's always been there.
We'll put it on the website.
Yeah.
We'll put a hard copy of the client satisfaction survey on the website under the forms section.
Yeah, so the question was, where can you find it? Will you write up all your questions in your FAQ document online or elsewhere?
Yeah. So if any changes we make to the guidelines go into the FAQ, questions and answers to this webinar, we would be in a separate document. So FAQ is really important to remember that that's where actual changes to the guidelines are kept up. But absolutely, we'll write up answers to these. Can CHG be used to pay for a porta potty at a tent city? I don't believe so. We can certainly get back to you on that one, but I don't think off the top of my head that that would be an allowable expense. How can mats on the floor comply with HHS?
The building.
It's not the mats on the floor, it's the building, it's a facility inspection. So I don't know that the mats on the floor as much as the issue is just the general building.
Do you have your fire alarms and all those things, you know, working windows, you don't want leaky faucets, just the normal things we want in a safe facility.
Okay. Should we go to the next section?
And next up is Emily to talk about extra requirements of service providers providing rent assistance. So put the in button.
And definitely follow up with your program manager if you have additional questions or nuances that you have after the webinar.
Okay, hi, it's Emily. I'm going to go over Section 7, which is requirements of all lead and sub-grantees providing rent assistance. So these things only apply to people who have rent assistance programs. So we changed the interested landlord list section a bit. We broke it out into two sections, the interested landlord list and outreach to landlords. We separated them into new sections and cut out a lot of extra words so that they're easier to understand, but the actual content and the requirement has not changed. You still have to maintain an interested landlord list, and you still have to do outreach to landlords. Section 7.3 is the Washington Residential Landlord Tenant Act. In the last contract, it was something you should do. We said that you should give the people you work with information about the Landlord Tenant Act, and now this is something you must do. So for your rent assistance clients, you must provide info on the Landlord Tenant Act to them if they're receiving rent assistance. Section 7.4 is rental agreements, and we just clarified some things, made it shorter, but it's no changes there. 7.5 is targeted prevention, which is not new, but there is a new CHG targeted prevention eligibility screening form, which I will bring up. So for any household, regardless if they're funded with the HEN households or TANF households, if they are at risk of homelessness, you have to use the targeted prevention screening form. And that's been updated. We emailed it out a while ago, but there are some changes. We added different weights. We took things away based on basically weighing the risk of homelessness factors have more weight than rapid or rehousing challenge factors. So there are some changes on there. Section 7.6 is rent limit. And while we're at this, I want to kind of go back to some of the questions I was answering earlier about household eligibility, because apparently some people missed my response. So about determining a rent share and how that intersects with the income eligibility guidelines. So for people who you're working with in a rent program who are homeless, you don't have to document their income at program entry. That doesn't have anything to do with how you determine the rent share. I think some people's internet went out when I was answering this question, so I'm going to answer it again. So you're probably going to check income if you're doing a rent program, because you're going to use that as a way to think about the household's expenses or their share of rent, and it doesn't have anything to do with the income eligibility. So if you have more questions about that, email your program manager. So the rent limit requirement has changed a little bit. You have to have a rent limit policy using HUD's fair market rent, and this is the maximum rent that you would pay for a unit of a given size. FMR does include rent and utilities, and we called that out because a lot of people weren't aware of that. The change to this is that if you choose a rent limit that exceeds 120% of FMR, you need to submit the rationale to Commerce by January 30th for approval. So you can make your rent limit policy any percentage of FMR that you feel is appropriate for your community, but if it exceeds 120%, you need to talk to your program manager and get approval from Commerce.
And that's different than if it's a case-by-case exception to the rent limit.
Right, this is your policy.
Which we do not need to approve.
Yeah, this is your policy for your agency. Yeah. 7.8 is determining rent subsidies. This used to be called determining a household's share of rent and utilities. So the content really hasn't changed. You need to have a procedure that describes how the rent subsidy is determined in your agency. You were previously required to identify your method. You need to have a procedure. A procedure is something that describes the series of steps to be followed to accomplish something. So your procedure needs to be a how-to of how rent is determined in your agency. And you need to document the subsidy amount and the determination process, or how you followed your procedure, in the client file. Are there any questions about that?
There are 2 questions about targeted, if you want to pull out, I think people could benefit from on the questions on targeted prevention.
And maybe bring up your form.
Bring up the form?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So the first one says, is the targeted screening form still a living document that we can make changes to, such as elderly who are unable to work or young single-parent households?
So I think the decision we made around our forms in general is that you can modify them, but we want you to maintain the content that you find on the form when you get it off the website. You can add additional criteria to this form, but we don't want you to delete any of these criteria that are on this form. You can also, particular to this form, you can change the scoring threshold at which households score in or score out. So that threshold of 15 points, you can raise or lower that depending on what you see happening as you apply this to households. So, for example, if all the households that you apply this to are screening in, then it might suggest that your scoring threshold is lower than it needs to be, and you might experiment with raising that by a couple of points. Keeping in mind the importance of tracking the people that you turn away, that screen out through this form.
And I also want to suggest that as you consider adding elements to the form, think about how they connect to your current homeless population, making sure that you're really targeting your prevention activities to the people who are most likely to become homeless.
Here's another question. If a HEN-eligible client doesn't score high enough on the targeted prevention eligibility form, can we not assist them?
This is exactly what the form is for, is that if a HEN-eligible person isn't screening in as someone who's at risk of homeless, there may be other interventions you can be considering for that person. So yeah, that's exactly what this form may prove, is that some HEN-eligible, what you might think at risk people aren't screening in. So what are the other opportunities to support them in housing that is outside of the Consolidated Homeless Grant?
And then, let's see, so somebody noticed that we have a misspelling.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. So we'll change that. And then, will there be a list of what's different in these guidelines? We'll need to communicate this information to subs.
We're not going to make a list of what's different in the guidelines. We actually started off that way a few months ago when we began the edits, but because we've cut them in half, we just couldn't keep...
And totally reorganize.
And totally reorganize them. We couldn't keep them. One of the things we'll make available, obviously, is the PowerPoint that identified some of the changes, but we're hoping that folks, because of the length, are down to less than 40 pages with the appendices, that people can take the time to read through them. Not even all the pages are completely full of text, so we're not developing, we've started off that way, but we realized it was way more confusing than not.
Any more questions?
That's all I heard.
Okay.
I just have one comment, this is Stephanie, that we did develop the original targeted prevention screening tool and then the updated one based on what limited evidence there is on the predictors of homelessness. And so we know it's not an exact science, and we hope that if you are making modifications to the form, you are also using, I think Kathy referred to this, you're doing that in an evidence-based way based on looking at your own HMIS data on who becomes homeless in your community. And our HMIS team is happy to help you look at that too if you have ideas. All right, this is Stephanie again, and I'm going to briefly go over the appendices, and then hopefully we'll have a few more minutes at the end if there are additional questions. We did, as far as reducing all of the guidelines, we really tried to pull out any of the fluff. We're going to have more resources available on the website that are really just informational or examples that don't need to be absolutely linked with the guidelines. All the forms are on the website, as we've mentioned. And I will just highlight a few of our favorite appendices. Appendix A, required forms. So we've been talking about forms a lot. All of the lists of the forms here, this isn't the full list, this is just the excerpt, are linked to the sections in the guidelines that they pertain to. And I will show you how that works. Can I shrink this?
Orange,
Shrink this?
orange arrow, yeah.
Okay. So I don't know if most of you print out your guidelines, that's great. I also love to navigate the guidelines in the Word document because it's really easy to navigate and jump around, and there's a lot of links here that don't work in the paper copy. So in the required forms, all of these are linkable, so it tells you what sections they come up with. And then it works the other way too. So when you're in that section, there's going to, and it mentions a form, everything is linked between the appendices in the document. So you can just click on it and it will take you right there if you want to read more about it. So that is a fun feature. This was in the last guidelines too. I'm not going to say too much more about the forms. Appendix B, I'll just look at the appendix, is a list of our required policies and procedures. You'll notice this list is pretty short. And again, it links to the sections in the guidelines, and the guidelines sections link here to the list. We took some things that we used to require that you have a policy on, but our requirements were so specific, we decided we would have a policy on it, and so the required policies and procedures that you have is really pretty limited. So we hope that this is more clear for people to follow along with. There's a lot of, similar to last time, helpful tables summarizing information for quick reference. Some of these are great if you want to print them and hang them over your desk on documentation. I want to point out Appendix D is new, and this is our performance measures that we've been referring to this whole webinar about unsheltered and the different ways we're going to measure that. So this really calls out the data elements, the target numbers, the dates that we're doing our baseline and referring back. So this you're going to refer to. This is all consistent with the policy memos and that we've been talking about the last few months, but it's here in the guidelines. And then a lot of this stuff hasn't changed. It's just either procedures, references, summary tables, income exclusions, all this fun stuff, HMIS requirements. Performance measures. So that's it. Those are the appendices. I'm not going to go through them all, but they're all there. Oh, sure. I'll just mention it. So instead of, we are going to be sending out our updated invoice processes and HMIS report instructions before the first invoice of the year is due. But part of that is not going to be requiring the essential needs report monthly like we have been in the past. Instead, we're going to have an annual report to collect that information. We don't need it monthly anymore. So we'll provide more details on that. So is that all you want me to say about it?
Questions? Yeah.
Is there any reference in the guidelines to using ESG guidelines if you are using due eligibility? I'm not understanding.
No, there's no reference in the guidelines, but it is something that we're really aware of here in that we sit right next to Nick as he manages the Federal Emergency Solutions Grant Program, and there are about 10 grantees around the state that have balance of state ESG funds plus CHG. We're looking to ensure that our forms are aligned so that especially if you're using different fund sources to pay for different activities, that you can better streamline your own documentation requirements. So if you find some issues or concerns that affect you as a grantee with both fund sources, point them out to us so we can get better at it and know that we're right there with our federal partners here at Commerce looking to make this as streamlined as possible for the grantees.
No more questions. Kathy, you want to close us out? Okay, Kathy's not doing so well. Thanks everybody for spending an hour and a half with us. Hopefully we've answered some of the preliminary questions you might have about the new guidelines. And as always, I'll encourage you to contact your program manager here. Oh, we do have a question.
Section 4 of the verification form, if someone is only receiving TANF and needs rent assistance to keep their home, would they need this form? Yes, if they're at risk of homelessness, this Section 4 needs to be completed, regardless of their source of income.
Mm-hmm.
For all at risk.
Yeah.
That's it?
That's it.
All right, no more questions, but you know how to find us, so make use of us, and I'm sure we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Close it?
No.